Hey guys, tonight we journey back, far back, to a time cloaked in stone and silence, where the rhythm of life was dictated by bells and prayer. Imagine yourself standing in the pre-dawn chill of a medieval monastery. The air is damp and smells faintly of wood smoke, old parchment, and something waxy. Outside, the world is just starting to stir, but inside these ancient walls, a different kind of awakening is happening. You can hear the soft shuffle of sandals on cold flagstone floors, the low murmur of voices in communal prayer, a sound that's been echoing here for centuries. It's a life of strict routine, humble meals, and dedication. But amidst this predictable world of devotion and manual labor, you'd notice something else, a surprising presence, marked by a low, persistent hum. Yes, bees. In a place devoted to God and scholarship, these tiny, buzzing creatures held an importance you might never guess. You probably won't survive 5 minutes trying to live the actual medieval monastic life, what with the dysentery and the lack of central heating, but tonight, you get the comfy, historical version. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're there, feeling the cold seep up from the floor, watching the first weak rays of sunlight struggle through a high, narrow window. The monastery is a fortress of faith, built not just for worship, but for survival. Life here is Spartan. Your days are a relentless cycle of prayer, study, and backbreaking labor in the fields, the scriptorium, or the workshops. Meat is a rarity, comforts are few, and the outside world often feels distant and dangerous. In this austere existence, every resource is precious, every source of sustenance, and light a gift. And that's where the bees come in, quietly, busily, providing two of the most vital commodities a medieval monastery could possess: honey and wax. Think about it. In a world without refined sugar, honey wasn't just a sweetener, it was the sweetener. A concentrated source of energy, a way to make bland porridge palatable, a key ingredient in medicinal concoctions, and even a preservative. Its value was immense, far exceeding anything we might pay for a jar today. It was liquid gold. And then there was the wax. In the gloom of those stone buildings, light was essential. Reading in the scriptorium, navigating dark corridors, illuminating the altar during services, all required light. Candles were the primary source, and the best candles, the ones that burned brightest and cleanest, were made from beeswax. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, smoked horribly and smelled worse. Beeswax was pure, clean, and shed a light considered worthy of the divine presence. It was, in essence, solidified light, a sacred glow drawn directly from the natural world. So, while you might picture monks tending gardens of herbs or copying ancient texts, you also need to picture them, cowled and perhaps a little wary, standing near buzzing wooden structures, carefully observing the flight paths of their tiny, winged laborers. The apiary, or bee-yard, was often a crucial, though perhaps understated, part of the monastic layout. It wasn't just a practical necessity, it was integrated into the spiritual and economic lifeblood of the community. Monasteries, particularly during the early and high Middle Ages, roughly 5th to 13th centuries, became centers of agriculture and craft. They cleared land, developed farming techniques, preserved knowledge through their libraries, and produced goods not just for their own consumption but also for trade. Among these goods, honey and wax were consistently high-value items. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic institutions played a critical role in maintaining and spreading agricultural knowledge, including apiculture, across Europe after the decline of the Roman Empire. They weren't inventing beekeeping from scratch, but they were standardizing it, recording it, and practicing it on a scale that made them significant producers. The surprising importance of bees wasn't just about calories and candles, though. It was also about resilience. In a time when crops could fail, livestock could die, and famine was a constant threat, a healthy apiary provided a relatively stable source of valuable goods. Bees foraged regardless of whether the monks had a good wheat harvest. As long as there were flowers and trees, the bees would work, providing a buffer against the harsh realities of medieval life. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some medieval texts, drawing on classical sources like Virgil's Georgics, described bees with almost human-like or even divine characteristics. They were seen as models of industry, chastity. The queen bee was often mistakenly thought to be a king, or simply a fertile worker, and the hive structure was admired, and social order. For monks who lived by strict rules and valued community, the seemingly perfect, hierarchical society of the hive was a fascinating subject of contemplation, a tiny buzzing metaphor for the ordered universe. This wasn't just farming, it was farming with a side of profound, if sometimes misinformed, biological philosophy. The question of how much monastic beekeeping contributed to the overall medieval economy is something historians still argue whether they were the primary drivers of apicultural development, or simply the most prominent practitioners of existing techniques. Regardless, their presence and reliance on bees is undeniable. You see hints of it in monastic rules, in account books listing goods produced and traded, and even in the layout of monastery grounds, with sheltered spots often designated for the apiaries. So, picture that monk again, standing in the early light. He's not just hearing a buzz, he's hearing the sound of food, light, medicine, trade goods, and perhaps a tiny, intricate reflection of the divine order he dedicates his life to understanding. The bees weren't peripheral. They were woven into the fabric of monastic life, their hum an essential note in the symphony of the cloister. And understanding this fundamental connection is our starting point for exploring how these men of faith managed, cherished, and ultimately relied upon their humble, yet invaluable, colonies of bees. You're standing there, feeling that cold seep into your bones, the stone walls breathing dampness, and you hear the hum. It's a quiet counterpoint to the structured sounds of monastic life, the bells marking the hours, the chanted prayers, the rhythmic scrape of a quill on parchment, the thud of a hoe in the garden soil. This isn't the comfortable, climate-controlled existence you know. This is a life of deliberate austerity, designed to focus the mind and spirit on the divine, but also brutally practical. Your bed is likely a straw mattress, your clothing rough wool, your meals simple, often repetitive. The days are long, starting before dawn and ending after sunset, filled with a demanding schedule of worship, study, and manual labor. Think about the energy required just to get through a medieval day. No cars, no elevators, often not even paved paths. You're walking, digging, hauling, chopping wood, grinding grain, copying heavy manuscripts by hand in dim light. It's physically exhausting work, day in and day out, fueled by a diet that was, by modern standards, incredibly bland and often nutritionally limited. You might have coarse bread, watery porridge, vegetables from the garden, maybe some cheese or eggs if the monastery kept livestock, and fish on fast days. Meat was a luxury, often restricted to guests or special occasions. Spices were exorbitant. Salt was valuable but didn't add sweetness. In this world of dietary restraint and physical exertion, honey wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was a fundamental source of energy and one of the few ways to add pleasure, a moment of simple sweetness, to an otherwise austere meal. Imagine spooning a bit of thick, golden honey into that bland porridge. It transforms it from mere sustenance into something approaching a treat. It makes heavy, dark bread more palatable. It could be mixed with water to make a simple, energizing drink. It was concentrated calories, readily available energy, the medieval equivalent of a high-energy snack bar, but far more natural and far more prized. This wasn't just about making food taste better, though that was certainly a welcome bonus. It was about providing the fuel needed for those long hours of labor and devotion. A monk spending hours digging a drainage ditch or working in the scriptorium needed sustained energy. Honey delivered that. It was a reliable source of calories when other crops might fail due to bad weather or disease. While monasteries aimed for self-sufficiency, they were still vulnerable to the same environmental factors as anyone else. A healthy apiary provided a hedge against hunger, offering a consistent yield regardless of the wheat harvest. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries were pioneers in organized agriculture and resource management during the Middle Ages. They systematically cleared land, implemented crop rotation, or variations of it, managed forests, raised livestock, and crucially, developed and maintained apiaries. They weren't just surviving, they were often thriving, producing surpluses that could be traded or used to support the poor, further cementing their vital role in society. This systematic approach extended to their bees, treating them as a valuable agricultural asset that needed careful tending. Now, while honey was clearly important for energy and palatability, how central was it to the average monk's daily diet? Historians still argue whether honey was a staple consumed regularly by everyone, or if it was more of a valuable commodity primarily produced for trade, with internal consumption limited to special occasions or medicinal uses. Some monastic rules were quite strict about diet, and while honey wasn't forbidden like meat, excessive sweetness might have been seen as a worldly indulgence. So, while it was always valued, its daily presence on every monk's trencher might have varied depending on the order, the specific monastery's wealth, and the abundance of their harvest. There's a quirky tidbit here about fasting. Monastic life involved frequent fasts, often meaning no meat, dairy, or eggs. Fish was usually permitted, but what about honey? Generally, honey was considered permissible during fasts. It wasn't an animal product in the same way meat or dairy were, and its natural origin made it acceptable even when other richer foods were forbidden. So, on those long, lean fasting days, that bit of honey might have been one of the few sources of concentrated comfort and energy allowed, making it even more precious. Imagine the simple relief of that sweetness on a day when your usual limited fare was restricted even further. It wasn't exactly a banquet, but it was a tiny bright spot in a world of deliberate deprivation. You might complain about skipping dessert after dinner, but try skipping everything but bread and water, and then be told you can have a spoonful of honey. Suddenly, that spoonful feels like a feast. It really puts your dessert cravings in perspective. The monk you pictured earlier, watching the bees, knew intimately the value of their work. He wasn't just observing nature, he was observing his pantry, his energy source, his small comfort. The hum of the hive was the sound of his next meal being sweetened, the fuel for tomorrow's labor being gathered, a taste of something pure and good in a tough world. It was a direct link to the bounty of nature, perceived through a lens of faith and necessity. This connection wasn't just practical. It was deeply ingrained in the monastic understanding of their place in the world and their reliance on God's creation for survival. The bees weren't just insects. They were providers, tiny miracles whose tireless work literally sustained the community. And this sustenance was just the beginning of their gifts. You're getting the picture now. This wasn't just some hobby for the monks, like tending a few petunias by the refectory door. The bees were serious business. And the products of their labor, that liquid gold, honey, and that solid light, wax, were commodities of incredibly high value in the medieval world. We touched on honey as sustenance, a vital energy source in a tough, low-sugar diet. But its importance stretched far, far beyond just sweetening your gruel, and wax was arguably even more valuable. Let's start with honey. Forget the little plastic bear you might squeeze onto your toast today. Medieval honey was a luxury item, a concentrated form of wealth. Why? Because refined sugar was virtually unknown in Europe for much of the Middle Ages. What little cane sugar made it through trade routes was astronomically expensive, available only to the wealthiest nobles or royalty, measured out in tiny, precious amounts like a rare spice. For everyone else, the only significant source of sweetness was honey. This made it indispensable not just in the kitchen, but everywhere sweetness was desired or needed. Think about medieval medicine. Drawing on classical texts and empirical knowledge, monks and other healers concocted all sorts of poultices, syrups, and elixirs. Honey, with its natural antibacterial properties, which they wouldn't have understood scientifically, but observed empirically, and its soothing texture, was a common base or ingredient in remedies for coughs, sore throats, wounds, and digestive issues. It wasn't just a sweetener for bitter herbs. It was seen as having medicinal virtues of its own. A monk tending to a sick brother might reach for a jar of honey as readily as a bundle of herbs. Beyond food and medicine, honey was also crucial for medieval brewing. Mead, the fermented honey drink, was popular in many regions, offering a stronger, more celebratory beverage than ale or wine. But even for brewing ale, honey could be used to kickstart fermentation or add complexity and strength. Given that water quality was often questionable, fermented drinks were safer and more commonly consumed than plain water, making brewing a vital activity. Honey's role here added another layer to its value. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries were key centers of trade and economic activity in the Middle Ages. They produced surpluses of agricultural goods, textiles, metalwork, and other crafts, which they traded for things they couldn't produce themselves or sold for income. Honey and wax were consistently among their most valuable trade goods. Records from monasteries often list quantities of honey and wax produced, consumed, and sold, indicating their significant economic contribution. They weren't just providing for themselves, they were active participants in the wider medieval economy, and their apiaries were like tiny, buzzing factories churning out high-demand products. Now, let's talk about wax. If honey was liquid gold, beeswax was solidified sunlight, and arguably even more critical. In a world plunged into darkness after sunset, light sources were limited. Torches smoked and were fire hazards. Rushlights, rushes dipped in fat, were cheap but flickered poorly and smelled dreadful. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were better but still smoked heavily, dripped grease, and emitted a foul odor, especially in enclosed spaces like a church or a scriptorium. Imagine trying to read or copy a precious manuscript for hours in the smoky, smelly gloom of tallow candles. It would be miserable, and probably ruin your lungs and the parchment. Beeswax candles were the premium option. They burned with a clear, bright, steady flame, produced very little smoke or odor, and lasted longer than tallow candles of the same size. This made them indispensable for activities requiring good, clean light, reading and writing in the scriptorium, illuminating the altar and nave during lengthy church services, which often occurred before dawn or after dusk, navigating the monastery's dark corridors and stairwells at night, and providing light for detailed craft work. The value of beeswax wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic and spiritual. The pure, clean light of a beeswax candle was considered appropriate for illuminating sacred spaces and religious ceremonies. It symbolized purity, Christ as the light of the world, and the devotion of the faithful. Monasteries, as centers of worship, required vast quantities of beeswax candles for their many daily services. Imagine the sheer number of candles needed to light a large abbey church for matins before dawn or vespers and compline after sunset, every single day. This constant, high demand further drove the value of beeswax. Beyond candles, beeswax had other important uses. It was used as a sealant for documents and letters, providing proof of authenticity and privacy. It could be used in crafting, woodworking, and even for polishing surfaces. A quirky tidbit is that beeswax was also used to create writing tablets. A thin layer of wax was spread over a wooden board, and notes or drafts could be scratched into the wax with a stylus, then smoothed over and reused. This was a practical, reusable form of notebook long before paper was widely available or affordable, and it relied directly on the bees' output. Historians still argue whether the primary focus of monastic beekeeping was internal consumption, feeding the monks, lighting the church, or external trade for profit. While both were undoubtedly important, the sheer scale of some monastic apiaries suggests that producing surpluses for sale or exchange was a significant motivation. The high demand and value of both honey and wax in the wider medieval society made them ideal commodities for monasteries looking to support themselves, acquire necessary goods, or fund their charitable activities. It's hard to imagine a medieval monastery saying, "Nah, we've got enough honey, let's just let the bees keep it." They knew a valuable resource when they saw, and tasted, and smelled it. The monks weren't just agrarian laborers, they were sophisticated managers of resources. They understood that their bee yards were literal gold mines and light factories. The hum of the hive wasn't just the sound of nature, it was the sound of income, of illumination, of medicine, and of sustenance. It represented security and value in a world where resources were often scarce and life was unpredictable. Tending the bees, risky as it sometimes was an investment with a high potential return, both for the physical well-being of the community and for its ability to fulfill its spiritual and economic roles. It makes you wonder if they ever considered hiring tiny, monk-shaped robots to do the harvesting, just to avoid the stings. Probably not. Robots weren't big in the 12th century. Anyway, the value of these bee products was immense, woven into the very fabric of medieval monastic life, from the humblest meal to the most sacred ceremony. You've felt the cold stone, tasted the simple sweetness of honey, and seen the sacred glow of beeswax candles. You understand why the bees were so important to these medieval monks. But here's the thing, the monks weren't the first people to figure this out. Not by a long shot. The relationship between humans and bees stretches back through millennia, long before cowls and cloisters were even a twinkle in someone's eye. The monks were inheritors and adapters of an ancient wisdom, taking practices that had evolved over thousands of years and refining them within their unique monastic context. Imagine going back even further, back to a time when finding honey wasn't about opening a hive, but about finding a wild nest. Early humans were intrepid honey hunters. There are cave paintings in Spain, like the famous one in the Cave of the Spider, dating back potentially 8,000 years, that depict figures scaling cliffs or trees to reach wild bee nests, often surrounded by buzzing insects. This wasn't just about getting a treat, it was about survival. Honey was a rare source of concentrated sugar and energy, and the comb itself could be chewed for nutrition and wax. It was a risky business, involving smoke, probably just burning bundles of grass or leaves, to subdue the bees, and a whole lot of bravery, or desperation. You probably wouldn't last 5 seconds trying that without modern protective gear. As human societies developed, the relationship evolved from hunting to something more akin to management. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, were sophisticated beekeepers. We have depictions in tombs and temples showing beekeepers tending hives made of cylindrical clay or reed tubes. They transported hives along the Nile River on boats to take advantage of different flowering seasons, a practice called migratory beekeeping, which is still used today. They used honey for food, medicine, and religious offerings, and beeswax was essential for mummification, sealing vessels, and even as an early form of writing surface or adhesive. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient Egypt had a highly organized beekeeping industry, with detailed records of honey and wax production dating back over 4,000 years, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding and reliance on bees far predating the medieval era. The knowledge and practice of beekeeping spread throughout the ancient world. The Greeks valued honey immensely, calling it the food of the gods, or nectar. Philosophers and naturalists like Aristotle studied bees, attempting to understand their complex social structure, although their conclusions were often mixed with myth, like the idea that bees were born from decaying animal carcasses. Charming. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, recommended honey for various ailments. The Romans, ever practical, also embraced beekeeping. Writers like Virgil, in his Georgics, dedicated entire sections to the care of bees, describing different types of hives, like woven baskets or wooden boxes, methods for swarm management, more on that later, and the properties of honey and wax. They understood the importance of location for the apiary, recommending sheltered spots near water and flowering plants. Their practices were detailed and systematic, laying much of the groundwork for later European apiculture. So, by the time the Roman Empire began to decline in the West, there was a long and rich history of beekeeping knowledge and practice across Europe and the Mediterranean. But with the breakdown of centralized administration, trade networks, and educational institutions, much of this knowledge became fragmented or was lost in various regions. Infrastructure crumbled, populations shifted, and the systematic, written traditions of Roman agriculture, including apiculture, were no longer universally maintained. This is where the monasteries stepped in. As islands of stability, learning, and organized labor in a turbulent world, they became conservators of classical knowledge. While they weren't necessarily inventing new beekeeping techniques from scratch in the early Middle Ages, they were collecting, copying, and preserving ancient texts that contained information about bees and their management. They were also practicing it on a communal, organized scale that allowed for continuity and gradual refinement. Historians still argue whether monastic beekeeping primarily preserved existing Roman techniques, or if it developed significantly new methods suited to the European climate and different hive types available. It's likely a bit of both. They certainly adapted the practices to their own needs and resources, and over centuries, their accumulated practical experience would have led to innovations or at least regional variations. For instance, while Romans used pottery and wooden hives, medieval monks often relied on skeps made of woven straw or wicker, adapting techniques to the materials at hand. A quirky tidbit from this ancient period is the Roman belief in beugonia, the spontaneous generation of bees from the carcass of an ox. Virgil describes this process in detail in the Georgics, offering it as a way to replenish lost colonies. This bizarre idea persisted for centuries, even influencing medieval thought, despite being completely wrong. Imagine finding a dead cow and thinking, "Great! Free bees!" It highlights how ancient knowledge, while sophisticated in some areas, was still mixed with superstition and misunderstanding before the advent of modern science. It makes you appreciate the monks' practical results, even if their theories were sometimes a bit bovine. The point is, the monks inherited a legacy. They didn't discover honey and wax. Humanity had been interacting with bees for thousands of years. What they did was take that scattered, ancient knowledge, combine it with their own practical experience, and integrate it into the structured, self-sufficient economy of the monastery. They provided the stability and continuity needed to maintain and spread beekeeping practices during a period of significant societal change. They turned an ancient craft into a cornerstone of medieval monastic life, ensuring that the hum of the hive, and the bounty it produced, would remain a vital part of the European landscape. They took the baton from the ancients and ran with it, making sure that the sweet, sticky, glowing legacy of the bee continued to thrive. And to do that effectively, they needed the right location. You've felt the cold stone, tasted the simple sweetness of honey, and seen the sacred glow of beeswax candles. You understand why the bees were so important to these medieval monks. You also know they weren't inventing beekeeping from scratch. They were carrying on traditions thousands of years old, taking that ancient wisdom and applying it. And one of the most critical applications of that knowledge was choosing just the right spot for their apiaries. It wasn't just about sticking the hives wherever there was space. It was a deliberate, strategic decision, informed by centuries of observation and a deep understanding of the bee's needs, all filtered through the lens of monastic life. Imagine you're a monk tasked with setting up a new bee yard. Where do you put it? You can't just plunk the hives down in the middle of the windiest field or the deepest, darkest woods. Bees are fussy. They need certain conditions to thrive, and the monks knew this. The ideal location for a monastic apiary was typically sheltered from prevailing winds, especially cold northern blasts. This might mean placing it against the south-facing wall of a building, within a walled garden, or in a natural hollow or copse of trees that offered protection. Think of it like finding a cozy, wind-free sun trap, perfect for tiny, buzzing creatures who need warmth to get going. Sunlight was crucial, particularly in the cooler climates of northern Europe where many monasteries were located. Bees need warmth to start their foraging flights in the morning and to keep the hive temperature stable. A spot that received plenty of morning and midday sun helped the colony wake up and get to work earlier, and kept the hive warm enough through the day and into the evening. So, a south or southeast-facing slope or area was often preferred. You wouldn't want to put your valuable honey factories in a perpetually shaded, chilly spot, would you? That would be like trying to run a medieval bakery in a dungeon, inefficient and probably a bit grim. Water was another non-negotiable requirement. Bees need water for drinking, diluting honey stores, especially in winter, and cooling the hive on hot days by evaporating water inside. A nearby clean water source, a stream, pond, or even a specially provided trough, was essential. Monasteries were often built near rivers or had elaborate water systems, making this requirement easier to meet. A well-placed apiary wouldn't force the bees to fly long distances for this vital resource, saving them energy and time. And then, of course, there was the food source. Bees need nectar and pollen, and lots of it, from spring right through to autumn. The location of the apiary needed to be within easy flying distance of abundant flowering plants. Monasteries typically had extensive gardens, orchards, meadows, and often access to surrounding woodlands or heathland. Placing the apiary near the herb garden, many herbs like borage, thyme, and rosemary are excellent bee forage, the fruit trees, or adjacent to a rich meadow was a smart move. It ensured the bees had a diverse and continuous supply of food, leading to healthier colonies and more honey and wax. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic agricultural planning included cultivating or managing areas specifically for bee forage, recognizing the direct link between available flowers and apiary productivity. They understood ecological relationships in a practical sense, even without modern scientific terms. Protection was also a key consideration. Hives were vulnerable to various predators: badgers, foxes, mice, and even larger animals like bears in some regions. Humans were also a potential threat, as honey and wax were valuable commodities ripe for theft. Placing the apiary within the monastery walls offered the most security, though space constraints might mean it was located just outside, perhaps within a fenced enclosure or in a spot easily overlooked or defended. The monks weren't just protecting their bees, they were protecting their investment and their vital resources. Imagine trying to explain to the abbot that a badger ate the year's supply of candle wax. Not a conversation you'd want to have. Now about the sacred apiary grounds aspect. While practicality certainly dictated much of the placement, there was often a spiritual dimension too. Bees were seen as God's creatures, models of piety, hard work, and purity. The apiary might be located in a quiet, contemplative part of the monastery grounds, perhaps near the infirmary garden, linking the bees' healing products, honey and wax, to the care of the sick. Some monastic texts hint at the apiary being a place for reflection on the natural world as a manifestation of divine order. Historians still argue whether apiary placement was primarily driven by purely practical needs for optimal bee health and security, or if symbolic and spiritual considerations also played a significant role in choosing the sacred ground. It's likely a blend, where the most practical spot also felt appropriate for housing such symbolically important creatures. There's a quirky tidbit related to this. Some medieval beekeeping lore suggested placing the apiary in a spot where a virtuous person had recently died, or even near a church or cemetery, believing it would bring good fortune to the bees. Other traditions involve blessing the hives or placing religious symbols nearby to ward off evil spirits, or ensure the bees' health. While we might see this as superstition today, for the monks, it was an integrated part of their worldview, where the spiritual and the practical were intertwined. Ensuring the bees' well-being involved both providing the right environmental conditions and seeking divine favor for these tiny, industrious servants of God and man. They weren't just managing insects, they were stewarding a gift from creation. The care taken in selecting the apiary site underscores how seriously monasteries approached beekeeping. It wasn't a haphazard activity. It was a planned, organized endeavor requiring knowledge, observation, and a significant amount of labor, both in setting up and maintaining the ideal location. The hum of the bees emanating from their sheltered, sunny spot wasn't just the sound of nature. It was the sound of careful planning, of ancient wisdom applied, and of a community investing in its own sustenance, light, and economic stability. It was the sound of a vital part of the monastic engine, quietly buzzing away, turning sunshine and flowers into the liquid gold and solid light that made medieval life possible. And this careful placement was just the first step. Next came the housing itself. You've chosen the perfect spot for your monastic apiary, sheltered from the wind, facing the morning sun, close to water and flowering fields. The hum of the bees is already a promise of future sweetness and light. But where do these industrious little creatures actually live? What kind of homes do you, as a medieval monk, provide for them? Forget the neat, stacked wooden boxes with removable frames that modern beekeepers use. Those are centuries away. Medieval monastic hives were much simpler, reflecting the materials available and the long-standing traditions of the time. The most common type of hive you'd likely see in a medieval monastery was the skep. Imagine a basket, but made specifically for bees. Skeps were typically woven from straw or wicker, sometimes bound with brambles or split cane. They were shaped like an upturned bowl or a cone, with a small entrance hole at the bottom. Building skeps was a craft in itself, often undertaken by the monks or local villagers. The materials were readily available: straw from harvested grain, pliable branches from trees. This made them relatively cheap and easy to construct, a significant advantage in a resource-conscious environment like a monastery. Skeps were usually placed on stands, perhaps a simple log, a stone slab, or a purpose-built wooden bench, to keep them off the damp ground and protect them from crawling predators. Sometimes, multiple skeps would be lined up on a long bench, looking a bit like a row of straw hats sitting in the sun. They blended into the rural landscape, humble structures for humble, hard-working inhabitants. They were practical, they were traditional, and they worked, in their own way. Another type of hive, particularly common in forested areas, was the log hive. This was essentially a section of a hollow tree trunk, capped at both ends with wooden boards or sometimes just mud or clay, with an entrance hole cut into the side. Log hives were durable and offered good insulation, protecting the bees from both cold and heat. They were also relatively easy to acquire if the monastery had access to woodlands. However, they were heavy and often difficult to manage compared to skeps. Less common, but not entirely unheard of, were rudimentary wooden box hives. These were simply hollowed-out sections of logs formed into a rectangular shape or boxes built from planks. These were perhaps a step towards more modern hives, but they still lacked the internal structure that makes modern beekeeping so much easier. Now, here's the crucial difference between these medieval hives and the Langstroth hives used today. There were no movable frames inside. Bees in skeps, log hives, and early box hives built their combs naturally, attaching them directly to the inside walls and ceiling of the hive. They created a solid mass of comb containing brood, pollen, and honey, all interconnected. This natural comb building had major implications for harvesting. With modern hives, you can lift out individual frames to inspect the colony, check for disease, or harvest honey from specific combs without destroying the rest of the hive. With a medieval skep or log hive, you couldn't do that. To get the honey, you often had to take the entire hive, or at least a significant portion of it. This usually involved either driving the bees out, using smoke or drumming on the hive, and then cutting out the comb, or, more drastically, sacrificing the colony. Harvesting honey from a skep was often a destructive process. You might have to cut the comb away from the sides, crushing some of it in the process. To get a good honey yield, medieval beekeepers would often merge several weaker colonies in the autumn and then take the hives of the merged colonies or the strongest colonies, sadly sacrificing the bees inside to get at the comb. This was necessary to ensure they had enough honey and wax for the year, but it meant they had to rebuild their stock of colonies the following spring through swarming or capturing wild swarms. It wasn't exactly sustainable in the modern sense, but it was how they managed to secure their precious resources. A mainstream historical fact is that the widespread use of fixed comb hives like skeps and log hives meant that medieval beekeeping was often a more extractive and less sustainable practice than modern apiculture, frequently requiring the destruction of colonies to harvest honey and wax on a significant scale. This cycle of building up colonies in summer and reducing them in autumn was a fundamental rhythm of monastic beekeeping. The simplicity of the hives also meant that monitoring the health of the colony, or managing issues, was much harder. You couldn't easily look inside without disturbing the bees significantly. You relied on external signs, how busy the bees were, the sound of the hive, the presence of pests near the entrance. It was a bit like trying to diagnose a car engine problem just by kicking the tires. You learned to read the subtle cues, but you were often flying blind compared to a modern beekeeper. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of skeps in some regions, compared to the more common use of log hives in others, significantly impacted the long-term development of beekeeping techniques in Europe. Some suggest skeps, while cheap, were inherently less conducive to developing less destructive harvesting methods, potentially slowing the adoption of more advanced hive designs even when materials allowed. Others argue that the practicality and ease of making skeps made beekeeping accessible to more people and institutions, including smaller monasteries, thus spreading the practice widely, even if the techniques remain basic. There's a quirky tidbit about skeps. Because they were woven, they were somewhat porous. This meant ventilation was usually good, but it also made them less insulated than log hives. To help the bees survive cold winters, monks would often cover the skeps with straw mats, sacking, or even bury them partially in the ground or stack them inside a sheltered shed. They weren't just putting out baskets, they were creating a microclimate for their precious colonies, using whatever simple means were available to help the bees endure the harsh medieval winters. Imagine wrapping up a bunch of straw baskets like little presents for winter, a humble act of care for creatures so vital to their lives. So, while the hives themselves might seem incredibly basic to modern eyes, they represented the practical application of centuries of accumulated knowledge, adapted to the resources and limitations of the medieval world. They were functional, if sometimes frustratingly difficult to manage without causing disturbance. The hum emanating from these simple straw domes or wooden cylinders wasn't just the sound of bees working, it was the sound of medieval ingenuity, of adapting ancient crafts to the needs of the monastery, and of the fundamental, sometimes destructive, cycle required to turn the bees' labor into the valuable commodities of honey and wax. Tending these humble hives was a core part of the monastic routine, a demanding task requiring patience, observation, and a willingness to work directly with nature's most industrious, and sometimes prickly, workers. And managing those workers, especially during key moments like swarming, was a whole other challenge. You've chosen the perfect spot for your monastic apiary, sheltered from the wind, facing the morning sun, close to water and flowering fields. You've set up your humble hives, the straw skeps or perhaps some sturdy log sections. The hum emanating from them is a constant presence, a reminder of the work being done. But simply providing a home isn't enough. These are wild creatures, operating on their own complex instincts, and managing them, interacting directly with thousands upon thousands of buzzing, stinging insects, was perhaps the most daunting part of the medieval monk's beekeeping duties. This wasn't like weeding the herb garden or grinding grain. This was stepping into the unpredictable, sometimes painful, world of the hive. Imagine approaching a skep. There are no pristine white suits with veiled hoods, no thick leather gloves reaching up to your elbows. Your protective gear might be limited to your thick wool habit, perhaps a hood pulled tight, and maybe, just maybe, a piece of cloth wrapped around your face. You're relying more on timing, technique, and prayer than on physical barriers. Monks learned to approach the hives calmly, moving slowly and deliberately. They knew that sudden movements or vibrations could agitate the bees. They also learned the best times to interact, usually during the warmest part of the day when most of the older, more aggressive foraging bees were out in the fields, leaving the younger, less defensive bees at home. It was a delicate dance, requiring patience and a healthy respect for the potential for pain. One of the most critical, and sometimes chaotic, events medieval monks had to manage was swarming. Swarming is how a bee colony reproduces. When a hive gets crowded and resources are abundant, the bees raise a new queen, and the old queen leaves with about half the worker bees to find a new home. For the monks, this was a moment of both opportunity and anxiety. An opportunity because a swarm represented a free, ready-made new colony to add to their apiary, increasing their potential honey and wax yield. Anxiety because if the swarm flew away to a distant tree or cavity, that valuable resource was lost forever. Capturing a swarm was a dramatic affair. When a swarm issued from a hive, it would typically cluster temporarily on a nearby branch, bush, or structure while scout bees searched for a permanent dwelling. The monk's goal was to get to that cluster quickly before the scouts found a better spot too far away. This involved rushing out to where the swarm had landed, often with a new, empty skep or basket. The technique involved placing the empty hive below the cluster, and then sharply shaking or brushing the branch to dislodge the bees into the skep. If the queen went into the skep, the rest of the bees would follow. It sounds simple, right? Try doing it while thousands of disoriented bees are buzzing around your head, without modern protection. You needed steady hands, courage, and perhaps a bit of divine intervention. Imagine the scene, a group of robed monks, perhaps looking less serene than usual, frantically trying to coax a swirling cloud of bees into a straw basket. It probably wasn't quite as peaceful as copying manuscripts. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval beekeepers, including monks, relied heavily on natural swarming to increase the number of their colonies. Unlike modern beekeepers who can split hives artificially, the primary method of expanding the apiary was successfully capturing swarms from existing hives or finding and capturing wild swarms. This made swarm season a period of intense activity and importance. Losing a swarm meant losing a year's potential growth for the apiary. Another basic management task was feeding, particularly if stores were low going into winter or during a poor foraging season. Monks might feed the bees back some of the honey they had harvested, or a sugar syrup if they had access to sugar, though this was rare and expensive. They also needed to ensure the bees had access to water year-round. Checking on the hives involved careful observation from the outside, watching the flight path, noting the number of bees coming and going, listening to the hum of the hive. A weak or silent hum could indicate a problem, perhaps the loss of a queen or disease. Dealing with pests and diseases was also part of the job, though their understanding was limited. They knew that mice or wax moths could devastate a hive, destroying the comb. They would try to keep hive entrances small enough to deter mice and keep the apiary clean. But for internal problems like brood diseases, they had little recourse. If a colony became weak or diseased, it was often left to die or was culled to prevent spread, and the comb harvested for wax, which could be melted down and purified, hopefully killing pathogens, and honey. The risks associated with handling bees this way were significant. Stings were a daily reality. While most stings are just painful, multiple stings can be dangerous, and allergic reactions, though likely not understood in modern terms, would have occurred and could be fatal. Working directly with swarms or harvesting honey from fixed comb hives without proper protection increased these risks dramatically. It required a certain fortitude and acceptance of discomfort, perhaps even seeing the stings as minor penances or simply part of the labor required for such valuable resources. You probably wouldn't have many monks volunteering for swarm duty if they were afraid of a little pain. Historians still argue whether the frequency of swarming in medieval hives, which tended to be smaller and swarm more readily than modern hives, was a deliberate feature of their management strategy, or simply an unavoidable consequence of their hive types and limited understanding of colony control. Did they embrace swarming as the easiest way to get new colonies? Or were they constantly struggling to manage a natural instinct that often resulted in lost swarms? It's hard to say definitively from the surviving records. There's a quirky tidbit about medieval swarm capture. Some traditions involve making noise, like banging pots and pans or ringing bells, near the swarm cluster. This practice, known as tamed, was believed to encourage the bees to settle and stay put, perhaps by mimicking the sound of thunder which bees instinctively associate with seeking shelter. While modern science suggests the sound itself doesn't do much to the bees, the activity of the beekeeper tanging might have helped keep the swarm compact and focus the bees' attention, or perhaps it was simply a ritual believed to bring good luck. Imagine the scene: monks in their habits, running around the monastery grounds, banging on metal objects like a medieval marching band, all for a cloud of bees. It certainly adds a bit of unexpected sound to the silent cloister. Managing these holy swarms and tending the humble hives was a demanding, sometimes dangerous, but essential part of monastic life. It required a deep connection to the natural world, a willingness to face the sting, and a reliance on accumulated traditional knowledge, observation, and faith. The success of the apiary, and thus the supply of precious honey and wax, rested on the monks' ability to interact with these complex creatures, guiding their natural instincts towards the needs of the community. It was a hands-on job, literally, involving the direct handling of nature's tiny, buzzing miracles. And once they managed to keep the bees healthy and housed, the next challenge was getting the goods out. You've guided the swarms, kept the humble hives upright, and watched your tiny charges tirelessly work the fields and gardens through the long days of summer. The hum has been a constant, reassuring presence. Now, as the days begin to shorten, and the vibrant greens of summer mellow into the richer hues of autumn, your focus shifts. The time has come for the harvest. This is the moment you've been waiting for, the culmination of months of careful tending, of braving stings and hoping for good weather. It's time to collect the liquid sun, the precious honey, and the solid light, the wax, that the bees have so diligently stored. But remember those simple hives? Those straw skeps and log sections with no internal structure? This is where their simplicity becomes your biggest challenge. Unlike modern beekeeping, where you can lift out a frame of comb, scrape off the wax capping, extract the honey with a centrifuge, and return the comb to the hive, medieval harvesting was a far more direct, and often destructive, process. You can't just politely ask the bees to step aside while you borrow some honey. You have to take the comb, and often, that meant taking the hive itself. The harvest typically happened in late summer or early autumn, after the main nectar flows had finished, and the bees had capped their honey stores for winter. The monks would assess their hives. Some weaker colonies might be combined to increase their chances of survival over winter, or their stores would be harvested entirely, sacrificing the colony. Strong, heavy hives, bursting with honey, were prime candidates for harvest. The goal was to take enough for the monastery's needs and for trade, while leaving sufficient stores for the remaining colonies to survive the lean months ahead. This balance was crucial, and misjudging it could mean losing valuable colonies to starvation over winter. Approaching a hive for harvest was perhaps the riskiest interaction of all. The bees were protective of their winter stores, and disturbing the hive meant facing the full force of the colony's defense. Monks would often use smoke, much like ancient beekeepers, puffing smoldering material, perhaps dried dung, rotten wood, or rags, into the hive entrance. The smoke doesn't necessarily make the bees sleepy. It triggers an instinct to gorge on honey in anticipation of abandoning the hive due to fire. This makes them more docile and less likely to sting, as their abdomens are full and they are focused on their stores. It's a basic, but effective, way to reduce the immediate risk, though it still didn't eliminate it entirely. Imagine trying to calmly smoke a hive while knowing thousands of angry bees are just inside, contemplating their life choices and whether stinging you is worth it. Once the bees were somewhat subdued, the real work began. If using a skep, you might carefully lift it or tilt it. The comb was attached directly to the straw roof and sides. Using a knife or other sharp tool, you would carefully cut the comb away from the inside of the skep. This was a messy, sticky business. Comb would break, honey would drip, and bees would inevitably become agitated despite the smoke. You had to work quickly and efficiently, trying to get as much intact comb as possible. With log hives, which were heavier and more difficult to maneuver, access was often gained by removing one of the end caps and cutting the comb from there, again a challenging task. A mainstream historical fact is that due to the fixed comb nature of medieval hives, harvesting honey often involved the destruction of the beeswax comb, which then had to be rendered and purified separately. This meant that the bees had to expend significant energy rebuilding their comb every year, making the process less efficient in terms of bee labor compared to modern methods where comb is reused. The comb itself was a valuable byproduct, as it contained the precious beeswax. The harvested material wasn't just pure honey. It was chunks of beeswax comb filled with honey, sometimes mixed with pollen or even brood, bee larvae and pupae. This sticky, gooey mass was then taken away from the apiary to a dedicated area for processing. You probably ended up covered in honey, with stray bits of comb sticking to your habit. Not exactly the clean, precise work of the scriptorium. Extracting the honey from the comb was a low-tech affair. The most common method was crushing or pressing. The chunks of comb were placed in a container, perhaps a wooden tub, a ceramic pot, or even a cloth bag. Then, the comb was simply crushed or squeezed by hand, or pressed using weights or a simple screw press if available. This broke open the cells, releasing the liquid honey. It was a labor-intensive process that didn't get every last drop, but it was effective enough to yield significant quantities. After crushing, the resulting mixture of honey, crushed wax, and other debris needed to be separated. This was done through straining. The sticky liquid was poured through a sieve or a piece of coarse cloth to remove the larger pieces of wax and dead bees. Yes, that happened. The honey would then be left to settle in a clean container. Any remaining wax or impurities would float to the top and could be skimmed off. The honey was then typically stored in ceramic jars, wooden barrels, or sometimes even in animal skins for transport or long-term storage. Historians still argue whether medieval monks developed specific tools or techniques for honey extraction that were significantly more advanced than those used by secular beekeepers of the time, or if they primarily relied on the same basic methods that had been in use for centuries. While monastic records sometimes mention specialized equipment, it's unclear how widespread or truly innovative these were compared to general agricultural practices. The yield from a single hive could vary greatly depending on the colony's strength, the weather, and the abundance of flowers that year. A good hive might yield a significant amount of honey and wax, representing a substantial return on the monk's investment of time and labor. A poor year could mean barely enough for the monastery's own needs. This unpredictability added another layer of dependence on nature's cycles and, for the monks, on divine providence. A quirky tidbit about the harvest process relates to the comb itself. After the honey was extracted by crushing, the remaining wax and bits of comb were not discarded. They were saved for the next crucial stage, purifying the beeswax. This raw, sticky mass, often mixed with honey residue and other impurities, was the raw material for the valuable candles and other wax products. So, even the waste from the honey harvest was a precious resource, carefully collected and set aside for later processing. Nothing was wasted in the efficient, resource-conscious world of the monastery. Harvesting the honey was a highlight of the beekeeping year, a tangible reward for the effort expended. It was a demanding, sticky, and sometimes painful process, requiring courage and brute force alongside patience and observation. It highlighted the fundamental difference between medieval and modern beekeeping, the necessity of interacting directly and often disruptively with the hive to obtain its treasures. But the result, jars filled with golden, liquid sweetness and chunks of wax-laden comb, was more than worth the effort. It was the taste of survival, the promise of light, and a direct connection to the tireless work of their humble, holy swarms. And with the sticky honey safely stored, the focus could turn to that other, equally valuable product, the wax. You've wrestled with the hives, braved the buzzing chaos, and emerged sticky but triumphant, your containers filled with that precious liquid gold. But as you were crushing the comb for honey, you were also careful to collect the residue, the chunks of beeswax, mixed with honey, propolis, pollen, and maybe a few unfortunate bee bits. This sticky, unrefined mass might not look like much, but it holds the promise of light, the raw material for those clean-burning candles so vital to monastic life. Now, the focus shifts from extracting the sweetness to refining the light. It's time to turn that messy byproduct into pure, usable beeswax. Imagine taking that sticky, yellowish-brown mess to a different corner of the monastery, perhaps a workshop or a dedicated area near the kitchen or forge where heat is available. The process of purifying beeswax in the Middle Ages was essentially about melting it down to separate the wax from everything else. It sounds simple, but it required care and patience. You can't just boil it like water. Wax is flammable, and overheating it can ruin its quality. The raw comb and wax scraps would be placed in a pot or cauldron, often made of iron or copper, along with water. The mixture would then be gently heated, typically over a low fire or perhaps even using a double boiler setup, placing the pot of wax and water inside a larger pot of water, to prevent scorching. As the water heats and the wax begins to melt, it separates from the heavier impurities like bee bodies, pollen, and propolis, which sink to the bottom. The lighter, melted wax floats on top of the water. Think of it like making a very rustic, bee-flavored soup, then skimming the fat off the top, except the fat here is liquid gold, or rather, liquid light. Once the wax is fully melted and floating, the crucial next step is straining. While still hot and liquid, the melted wax and water mixture would be carefully poured through a filter. This filter might be a coarse cloth, linen, or even a fine mesh sieve made of horsehair or metal if available. This first straining removed the larger bits of debris, leaving behind a much cleaner liquid. You had to be careful doing this. Hot wax causes nasty burns, and spilling this valuable material would be a minor disaster. It wasn't a job for the clumsy monk. After the initial straining, the hot, filtered liquid, still a mix of wax and water, would be poured into molds or containers to cool and solidify. These molds could be simple earthenware pots, wooden trays, or even depressions scooped into the ground lined with clay or cloth. As the mixture cools, the wax solidifies on top of the water. Once completely cooled, the solid block of wax could be lifted out. The impurities that weren't heavy enough to sink before straining, or were too fine to be caught by the filter, would often settle at the bottom of the wax block, adhering to the layer of water. To achieve higher purity, this process might be repeated multiple times. The monk would take the resulting wax block, scrape off any impurities clinging to the bottom, and then melt it down again with fresh water, strain it again, and let it cool. Each cycle of melting, straining, and cooling removed more impurities, resulting in a cleaner, lighter-colored wax. The goal was to get a pure, yellow beeswax, free from debris, which would burn cleanly and efficiently. Imagine doing this over and over, patiently melting and filtering, watching the wax transform from a murky brown sludge into a beautiful, translucent yellow. It was a process that required dedication and a good understanding of temperature control. Too hot, and you risk fire. Too cool, and it won't filter properly. A mainstream historical fact is that the purity of beeswax was directly related to its value and use. High-purity beeswax, achieved through repeated melting and straining, was essential for making the best candles, particularly those used in churches, as it burned brightest and cleanest with minimal smoke. Lower-grade wax, which might still contain some impurities, could be used for other purposes where clarity of light wasn't as critical, or for non-candle applications. This tiered quality system meant that the effort put into purification directly impacted the economic return on the wax harvest. The color of the beeswax was often seen as an indicator of its purity and quality. Fresh, pure beeswax tends to be a bright yellow. Over time, or with certain impurities, it can darken. Medieval texts sometimes mention methods for bleaching wax, though this was less common in monastic settings which often prioritized natural methods. Leaving thin sheets of wax exposed to sunlight was one way to naturally lighten the color, but the primary method of purification relied on separating impurities through melting and straining. Historians still argue whether the level of sophistication in beeswax purification varied significantly between different monastic orders or regions. Did some monasteries develop more advanced techniques or use better filtering materials than others, leading to consistently higher quality wax? Or were the basic methods relatively uniform across medieval Europe, with variations mainly depending on the initial purity of the raw comb and the diligence of the individual monk performing the task? Surviving records offer glimpses, but a comprehensive picture of regional or institutional differences in wax processing techniques remains elusive. Beyond just melting and straining, medieval monks likely developed practical tricks through experience. They would learn how long to heat the mixture, what kind of cloth worked best for filtering, and how quickly to pour to avoid disturbing the settled impurities. They might notice that wax harvested at different times of the year, or from hives foraging on different plants, had slightly different properties or colors, requiring adjustments in the purification process. This wasn't just following instructions, it was a craft honed through observation and practice, passed down from older monks to younger novices. The resulting pure beeswax was typically cast into blocks or cakes for storage or trade. These solid blocks of golden wax were a tangible form of wealth, easily transported and measured. They represented the culmination of the bee's labor, the monk's care, and the purification process. Holding a smooth, fragrant block of pure beeswax must have felt incredibly satisfying, a clean, valuable product derived from the messy reality of the hive. It was the promise of light solidified, ready to be transformed into candles or used for its many other purposes. A quirky tidbit related to beeswax purification is the medieval belief that the purity of the wax reflected the purity of the bees themselves, and by extension, the purity of the natural world and even the divine order. Bees were seen as chaste and pure creatures, and their product, beeswax, was considered inherently clean and suitable for sacred uses. This spiritual connection added another layer of significance to the purification process. It wasn't just about getting rid of dirt. It was almost a ritual of refining a sacred substance for its holy purpose. Imagine thinking that by cleaning the wax, you were somehow honoring the virtuous nature of the bees and making their offering more acceptable for use in God's service. It elevates a messy, practical task into something with profound meaning. The purified beeswax, now gleaming and fragrant, was ready. Ready to be rolled or dipped into candles that would illuminate the scriptorium and the altar. Ready to be used as a sealant, a polish, a medicine, or a crafting material. The transformation from raw comb to pure wax was a testament to the monk's skill and dedication, turning a natural byproduct into one of the most valuable commodities of the medieval world. This wasn't just beekeeping, it was alchemy, transforming the mundane into the magical, the messy into the luminous. And with the pure wax ready, its many blessings could finally be realized. You've purified the beeswax, turning that messy, sticky residue into gleaming, solid blocks of potential light. It feels like a transformation, a kind of humble alchemy. But what about the main event of the harvest, the liquid gold itself? The jars and barrels are filled with honey, strained and settled. You've already tasted its simple sweetness, a rare pleasure in the austere monastic diet, a source of energy for those long, demanding days. But remember, honey wasn't just about making bland porridge palatable, or giving you a boost for digging drainage ditches. Its blessings in the medieval monastery were far more numerous, stretching into areas you might not immediately expect, proving just how indispensable those buzzing creatures truly were. Think back to the ancient wisdom the monks inherited. Honey wasn't just food to the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, it was medicine. And this tradition continued and thrived within the monastery walls. Monasteries often had infirmaries to care for sick or aging monks, and sometimes provided basic medical care to the local community. The monks who tended the sick, drawing on classical medical texts and their own practical experience with medicinal herbs, remember those carefully tended gardens? Quickly recognized the therapeutic properties of honey. Honey is naturally antimicrobial and antibacterial. While medieval monks wouldn't have understood the science behind it, the low water content, the presence of hydrogen peroxide produced by an enzyme the bees add, they observed the effects. They saw that wounds treated with honey seemed to heal better and were less likely to become infected than those left uncovered or treated with less effective substances. So, a monk with a cut or scrape might have it cleaned and then smeared with honey as a natural antiseptic dressing. Imagine the relief of a soothing, sticky application on a raw wound compared to, well, nothing, or something potentially irritating. It was also widely used internally. Honey mixed with warm water or herbal infusions was a common remedy for coughs, sore throats, and digestive upset. Its soothing texture could calm irritation, and its energy content provided strength to the ailing. Medieval medical texts compiled and preserved by monks are full of recipes for various concoctions, and honey frequently features as a key ingredient, either for its perceived medicinal virtues or simply to make bitter or unpleasant-tasting herbs more palatable. It was the go-to natural syrup of the age. If you had a cough, you weren't getting cherry-flavored medicine, you were getting honey, maybe with some hyssop or horehound mixed in. And honestly, given some of the other medieval medical practices, that sounds like a pretty good deal. Beyond the infirmary, honey played a vital role in the monastery's brewing operations. While ale made from grain was the staple drink, safer than water, and some monasteries produced wine, mead was a significant beverage, particularly in regions where grapes didn't grow well. Mead is simply fermented honey and water, sometimes with added fruits, spices, or herbs. It could range from a light, sparkling drink to a strong, potent brew. Monasteries, with their reliable supply of honey, were well positioned to produce mead, which was consumed internally and also potentially traded. It provided calories, hydration, and a bit of cheer in a demanding life. Even in brewing ale, honey could be used. While malted grain provided the primary sugars for fermentation, a bit of honey could be added to boost the alcohol content, improve the flavor, or aid the fermentation process. Given the amount of manual labor involved in monastic life, a stronger ale or a nourishing mead wasn't just about getting tipsy. It was a source of calories and energy, a liquid meal in some ways. You weren't just drinking for pleasure, you were drinking to keep going. Though I'm sure a bit of pleasure was involved too. Monks weren't that austere, usually. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries were significant producers and consumers of alcoholic beverages, and honey was a crucial ingredient in mead production, contributing to both the internal economy and the trade activities of these institutions. Their brewing practices, often detailed in monastic records, highlight the diverse ways in which agricultural products like honey were utilized beyond simple food consumption. Honey also had applications related to preservation. Its high sugar content and low water activity make it a natural preservative, inhibiting the growth of bacteria and mold. While not as common as salting or drying, honey could be used to preserve fruits or other perishable goods, allowing the monastery to store food for longer periods, a crucial capability in a time without refrigeration. Imagine coating some precious autumn berries in honey to save them for a winter treat, a small luxury made possible by the bees. Historians still argue whether the primary use of honey within monasteries was for daily consumption as a sweetener, an energy source, for medicinal purposes, or for brewing and trade. While all these uses were undoubtedly present, the relative importance of each likely varied depending on the specific monastery, its resources, its location, and thus the availability of other sweeteners like fruit, and the prevailing monastic rules or customs. Some orders might have emphasized its medicinal use, while others focused on its economic potential through mead production and trade. There's a quirky tidbit about medieval honey that goes beyond the practical. Some medieval texts and folk beliefs attributed almost magical properties to honey, sometimes associating it with fertility, purity, or even the ability to ward off evil. There are recipes for love potions or protective charms that include honey. While these might not have been official monastic practices, the general cultural perception of honey as a special, potent substance likely influenced how monks viewed and valued it, adding another layer to its significance beyond just calories and medicine. Imagine a monk, perhaps secretly, adding a spoonful of honey to a brew not just for flavor, but with a quiet hope for some extra blessing or protection. It shows how integrated these beliefs were into the fabric of daily life. So, the honey harvested from those humble hives wasn't just spooned onto bread. It was brewed into mead, mixed into cough syrups, smeared onto wounds, and perhaps even used to preserve small quantities of precious foodstuffs. Its value was multifaceted, touching upon sustenance, health, social life, through brewing, and the monastery's economic viability. It was a tangible gift from nature, channeled by the monk's care and the bees' industry, serving a remarkable variety of purposes that underscored its status as liquid gold. It makes you appreciate that little plastic bear of honey on your counter a bit more, doesn't it? Though I doubt the honey inside has quite the same history of treating medieval dysentery or being blessed for ritual use. The monks understood this deep, practical connection to the bee's bounty. Every jar of honey represented not just sweetness, but healing, energy, and potential trade. It was a resource managed with care and reverence, a product of the natural world harnessed to support the spiritual and practical needs of the community. And while honey was incredibly valuable, the other product of the hive, the beeswax, held a unique and perhaps even more sacred importance, particularly when it came to illuminating the monastery's most holy spaces. You've taken that sticky, messy comb, melted it down, strained it repeatedly, and scraped away the impurities. Now, finally, you hold in your hand a block of pure, clean, fragrant beeswax. It's transformed from a byproduct of the honey harvest into a valuable commodity in its own right. And while this wax had many practical uses we'll touch on, there was one purpose that elevated it above the mundane, one use where its value wasn't just economic or practical, but deeply spiritual, providing light, particularly the sacred glow for religious devotion. Imagine trying to read those heavy manuscripts, or navigate the dark, echoing corridors of the monastery after sunset, or perform solemn religious services before the first hint of dawn, relying solely on sputtering, smoky tallow candles. Tallow, made from animal fat, was cheaper and more readily available, but it was a poor substitute. Tallow candles smelled awful as they burned, often producing a rank, greasy odor. They smoked heavily, blackening walls and parchment alike, and they dripped constantly, making a mess and wasting precious fuel. Trying to concentrate on prayer or delicate copying work by the flickering, smelly light of a tallow candle would have been a miserable experience. You might as well try to read by the light of a campfire held indoors. beeswax candles were a revelation by comparison. They burned with a clear, steady, bright flame. They produced very little smoke, preserving the air quality in enclosed spaces and protecting precious books and artwork from soot damage. And crucially, they smelled faintly sweet and clean as they burned, a pleasant fragrance compared to the stench of tallow. This difference wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was seen as a matter of purity and reverence. The pure, clean burning light of beeswax was considered the only light fit for the altar, for illuminating the sacred texts, and for accompanying the most solemn moments of worship. Making these candles was another monastic craft. The most common method was dipping. Imagine having a large pot of melted beeswax, kept warm over a gentle heat. A wick, typically made of twisted linen or hemp fibers, would be attached to a rod or frame. You would dip the wick into the melted wax, let the wax cool and harden slightly, and then dip it again. And again. And again. Layer by layer, the beeswax would build up around the wick, gradually forming a candle. This was a repetitive, time-consuming process, requiring patience and a steady hand to ensure the candles were straight and evenly formed. It took many dips to build up a candle of substantial size, and you might be dipping multiple wicks on a frame at once to increase efficiency. Another method, perhaps for thicker candles or specific shapes, was rolling. Melted or softened beeswax could be rolled into sheets, a wick placed at one edge, and the sheet rolled tightly around the wick to form a candle. This method was perhaps simpler but less common for the bulk of monastic candle production compared to dipping, which allowed for more consistent sizes and shapes needed for different purposes. Regardless of the method, it was a hands-on job, turning the solid block of wax into the functional, luminous form of a candle. A mainstream historical fact is that beeswax candles were mandated for use on the altar and during many key religious services in medieval churches and monasteries. Ecclesiastical law and custom often stipulated that only pure beeswax candles were acceptable for these sacred purposes, distinguishing them sharply from the common tallow candles used elsewhere. This requirement created a constant, high demand for beeswax within religious institutions, making the monastery apiary essential not just for food and trade, but for the very practice of their faith. The monastery church, often a large and imposing stone structure, could be quite dark, even during the day, with light filtering only through high, narrow windows. For services held before dawn, like matins, or after dusk, vespers and compline, illumination was absolutely essential. Candles lined the altar, stood on lecterns for reading scripture, and were carried in processions. The sheer number of candles required for a large monastery, burning during multiple services every day, added up to a significant consumption of beeswax over the course of a year. Imagine the scene: the vast, dark space of the abbey church, gradually illuminated by the soft, warm glow of dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of beeswax candles, the only source of light besides the occasional lamp. It would have been a powerful, almost mystical experience, the light itself feeling pure and sacred. Beyond the practical need for light during services, the beeswax candle held deep spiritual symbolism for the monks. The pure wax was seen to symbolize the pure flesh of Christ. The wick represented his soul, and the flame his divinity, burning brightly and giving light to the world. The bees themselves, often perceived as chaste and industrious, were seen as fitting producers of this pure substance. Lighting a beeswax candle wasn't just turning on a light. It was a symbolic act of faith, a visual representation of Christ as the light dispelling darkness, and a physical offering of a pure product of God's creation. This symbolism was woven into the liturgy and the monks' understanding of their own devotion. Historians still argue whether the symbolic importance of beeswax candles in medieval religious practice was the primary driver for monastic beekeeping efforts, or if the practical and economic value of honey and wax for trade and consumption were the more significant motivations. While the spiritual dimension was undoubtedly present and emphasized in religious texts, the sheer quantity of wax needed for daily life, reading, writing, navigation, and the high value of both honey and wax in the medieval economy suggests that practical needs and economic incentives played a very substantial role in making beekeeping such a central activity. It's likely a complex interplay of all these factors, with the spiritual aspect giving the practical work an added layer of meaning. A quirky tidbit about medieval church candles relates to their size and weight. Large, imposing churches required equally large candles for the altar. These could be quite massive, sometimes weighing many pounds, and made by repeatedly dipping a thick wick over days or even weeks. Imagine the effort involved in making, moving, and maintaining these colossal candles, which were intended to burn for extended periods or on special feast days. They weren't just practical light sources. They were impressive displays of wealth and devotion, consuming vast amounts of precious beeswax and representing a significant investment in the monastery's spiritual life. Trying to dip a wick for a candle taller than yourself? That's a workout I'd skip. The beeswax candle, born from the messy reality of the hive and refined through patient effort, was the shining culmination of the monastic beekeeping year. It was the light by which prayers were read, scriptures were copied, and the divine presence was honored. It was a tangible link between the humble work of the natural world and the elevated realm of the spirit, a symbol of purity, devotion, and the light of Christ dispelling the darkness. Tending the bees and processing their wax wasn't just a chore. It was a contribution to the very essence of monastic life, providing the sacred glow that illuminated their path, both literally and figuratively. And yet, despite all this knowledge and care, the bees themselves remained creatures of mystery, their inner workings and sometimes sudden failures a source of both wonder and anxiety. You've taken that sticky, messy comb, melted it down, strained it repeatedly, and scraped away the impurities. Now, finally, you hold in your hand a block of pure, clean, fragrant beeswax. It's transformed from a byproduct of the honey harvest into a gleaming, solid block of potential light. And you hold the jars of honey, liquid gold, ready for use. You've done everything right, chosen the perfect spot, built the right hives, managed the swarms you caught, harvested with care, and purified the wax. You feel a sense of accomplishment, a connection to the ancient craft, and the rhythm of the seasons. But despite all your efforts, despite the accumulated wisdom of generations passed down through texts and practice, the bees themselves remained, in many ways, creatures of profound mystery to the medieval monk. You could watch them for hours, marveling at their tireless work, their intricate dances. Though you wouldn't call them that, you'd just see their purposeful movements, their apparent social order. They seemed to operate with a singular purpose, a tiny, buzzing reflection of the divine order you sought in your own life. But then, things would happen that defied easy explanation. A strong hive, buzzing with life one week, might suddenly dwindle the next. A swarm might issue forth not in the warm, predictable days of late spring, but at an unexpected time. Colonies would die over winter, even if you thought you'd left them enough stores. Bees, these symbols of purity and order, could also be frustratingly unpredictable and vulnerable. Understanding bee health in the Middle Ages was a far cry from modern veterinary science. Monks relied on observation, tradition, and sometimes superstition. They knew the signs of a strong colony, a busy entrance with bees flying purposefully, a healthy, vibrant hum, plenty of stored honey and pollen when you peeked, carefully, inside. They also learned to recognize signs of trouble, a weak or erratic flight, unusual quietness in the hive, a bad smell, though differentiating between different causes of smell would be hard, or the presence of pests. But the why behind these problems was often a mystery. They didn't understand brood diseases caused by bacteria or viruses. They didn't know about varroa mites or tracheal mites, devastating parasites that would arrive later in history. If a colony started dying off from disease, the monks wouldn't know the biological cause. They might attribute it to bad luck, poor foraging conditions, a weak queen they couldn't identify or replace, or even, in some cases, to supernatural influences or divine displeasure. Remember how bees were seen as pure. A dying colony might even be interpreted as a sign that something was amiss, perhaps even spiritually, with the beekeeper or the community. It's a bit like blaming your wilting houseplants on bad karma, not scientifically sound, but a way to make sense of something you can't control. Pests were a more tangible threat they could sometimes combat. Mice, attracted by the warmth and the stored honey and wax, could infest a hive, especially in winter, destroying comb and stressing the colony. Monks would try to keep hive entrances small to prevent mice from entering, and might place hives on stands to deter them. Wax moths were another persistent enemy. Their larvae tunnel through and devour beeswax comb, quickly devastating a hive. Monks would try to keep their apiary clean, removing old or weak comb that was susceptible to infestation, but without modern methods of control, a severe wax moth problem could be ruinous. Imagine trying to pick tiny moth larvae out of precious comb, another delightful task added to the monastic routine. You probably wished you had a tiny, bee-sized broom and dustpan for the job. Swarming, while essential for increasing colony numbers, was also a source of potential loss and mystery. Why did one hive swarm vigorously, providing you with several new colonies, while another, seemingly just as strong, never swarmed at all? Why did some swarms settle conveniently nearby, easy to capture, while others flew off into the distant woods, taking their potential wealth with them? Monks learned to anticipate swarming season, late spring/early summer, and watch for the signs: increased numbers of bees at the entrance, restlessness. But the exact timing and outcome of a swarm were always uncertain. Successfully capturing a swarm felt like a gift, a small miracle of nature aligning with their needs. Losing one felt like a failure, a missed opportunity. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monastic writings and agricultural treatises often included sections on beekeeping, detailing observations of bee behavior, methods for hive management, and advice on dealing with common problems like pests. While these texts lacked modern scientific understanding, they represent a significant effort to systematically record and transmit practical knowledge about apiculture, contributing to the continuity of beekeeping practices through the Middle Ages. Historians still argue whether the monastic focus on apiary management led to a deeper empirical understanding of bee biology and behavior compared to secular beekeepers of the time, or if their knowledge remained largely traditional, based on inherited practices rather than systematic experimentation. Did the contemplative nature of monastic life lead to more detailed observation, or was the need for practical output the primary driver of their beekeeping efforts? It's a buzzing question with no simple answer. The sheer resilience of the bees themselves, despite the rudimentary hives and limited understanding of their biology, must have seemed miraculous at times. A colony surviving a harsh winter, rebuilding quickly after swarming, or recovering from an unknown ailment could easily be seen as a sign of divine favor, a testament to the inherent goodness and strength of God's creation. The monks lived in a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was often blurred, and the mysterious workings of the hive were ripe for spiritual interpretation. A quirky tidbit from medieval lore is the belief that bees were particularly sensitive to human sin and discord. Some stories claimed that bees would abandon a hive or even die if the beekeeper or the household was living in sin, quarreling, or committing adultery. This belief added a moral dimension to beekeeping. Tending your bees wasn't just about practical work, it was also a reflection of your own spiritual state. Imagine the pressure. If your hive failed, was it because of wax moths, or because you secretly coveted Brother Thomas's extra helping of gruel? It certainly added a layer of spiritual anxiety to apiary management. It makes you wonder if they ever tried sending the most virtuous monk out to talk to the bees when a colony was struggling, hoping his purity would rub off. So, while the monks were skilled practitioners of an ancient craft, successfully producing valuable honey and wax year after year, they were also humble observers of a complex natural world they didn't fully comprehend. The mysteries of bee health, the sometimes unpredictable behavior of swarms, and the resilience of colonies against unseen threats were all part of the beekeeping experience. It required not just practical skill, but also patience, faith, and an acceptance that some things remained, quite literally, in the hands of a higher power, or at least, a power residing within the tiny, buzzing bodies of the bees themselves. These mysterious little creatures weren't just workers. They were sometimes seen as instruments of the divine, their successes and failures holding lessons or warnings for the observant monk. And those lessons went beyond just practical beekeeping, they informed the monks' spiritual lives as well. You've wrestled with the hives, braved the buzzing chaos, harvested the honey, and purified the wax. You've seen the practical value, the immense importance of these tiny creatures to your daily life, your health, your ability to practice your faith. You've also faced the mysteries, the colonies that thrive inexplicably, the ones that fail without obvious cause, the unpredictable nature of swarming. In a world where everything was seen through a spiritual lens, where the natural world was a book written by God, the bees, with their complex, seemingly ordered lives and their miraculous products, became profound symbols. For the medieval monk, the apiary wasn't just a farm. It was a living parable, a buzzing model of the virtues they strove for every single day. Think about the structure of the hive as they understood it, or sometimes misunderstood it. They saw a highly organized society, a community where every individual seemed to work tirelessly for the common good. There was a clear leader, the queen, though for centuries, she was often mistakenly believed to be a male king bee, ruling over a kingdom of workers. The worker bees were seen as obedient, diligent, and self-sacrificing, constantly laboring to build comb, gather food, and care for the young. Doesn't this sound remarkably like the ideal of a monastic community? A group of individuals living together under a strict rule, led by an abbot, the king or queen bee figure, with each monk, the worker bee, performing their assigned tasks, prayer, study, labor, for the benefit of the whole community and the glory of God? This parallel was not lost on the monks. They drew explicit comparisons between the disciplined life of the hive and the disciplined life of the cloister. The bees' industry was a direct inspiration for the monastic vow of labor. Ora et labora, pray and work. Just as the bees never seemed idle, the monks were expected to fill their days productively, avoiding sloth, which was considered a sin. Watching the bees endlessly flying out to forage and returning laden with pollen and nectar was a visual sermon on the virtue of hard work and dedication. If these tiny creatures, guided only by instinct, could labor so diligently, how much more should a man, guided by faith and reason, apply himself to his duties? The purity of the bees was another key symbol. Medieval lore often depicted bees, particularly the workers and the queen, as chaste. This belief, though biologically inaccurate, worker bees are infertile females, and the queen mates, resonated deeply with the monastic ideal of celibacy. The pure beeswax produced by these supposedly chaste creatures further reinforced this symbolism, making it the only fitting substance for the pure light of the altar. The wax, transformed from the messy reality of the hive into a clean, bright source of light, mirrored the spiritual transformation the monks sought in themselves, refining their earthly selves into something pure and illuminated by divine grace. It makes you wonder if they ever felt inadequate compared to the bees' perceived natural virtue. Well, at least the bees aren't secretly hoarding biscuits. Loyalty and order within the hive were also admired. Bees defended their queen and their hive fiercely, working together seamlessly. This was seen as a model of loyalty to one's superior, the abbot, and to the monastic rule. The structured comb, with its perfectly hexagonal cells, was viewed as a marvel of natural architecture, a physical manifestation of divine order and geometry. It was a tiny, intricate city built on principles of efficiency and community, reflecting the larger order of the cosmos as designed by God. Studying the comb wasn't just learning about beehousing, it was contemplating divine wisdom manifested in nature. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval sermons, theological texts, and bestiaries, books describing real and mythical animals, often with moral interpretations, frequently used bees and the structure of the hive as allegories for Christian virtues, the church hierarchy, and the ideal Christian community. Writers like Thomas of Cantimper, in his Bonum Universal de Apibus, The Universal Good of Bees, dedicated entire volumes to the moral and spiritual lessons to be drawn from observing bees, cementing their place as significant religious symbols. The process of making honey itself held symbolic meaning. The bees gathered nectar from countless individual flowers, transforming it through their labor into a unified, sweet substance stored in the hive. This was likened to the monk's life of prayer and study, gathering spiritual nourishment from various sources, scripture, contemplation, the lives of saints, and transforming it through devotion into wisdom and grace, stored within the soul or shared with the community. Honey, as liquid sweetness, also symbolized divine sweetness, the grace of God, or the rewards of a virtuous life. Tasting honey wasn't just a physical sensation, it could be a reminder of spiritual blessings. Historians still argue whether the symbolic and spiritual interpretations of bees significantly influenced the practical management of apiaries, or if the symbolism was primarily applied after the practical necessity of beekeeping was established. Did monks choose beekeeping because of the spiritual lessons the bees offered, or did they find spiritual lessons in bees because they were already keeping them out of practical need? It's likely a dynamic relationship, where the practical benefits reinforce the symbolic value, and the symbolic value encouraged the continuation and care of the apiaries. There's a quirky tidbit related to the queen bee. As mentioned, monks often thought the queen was a male king. This king was seen as ruling his hive with wisdom and authority, guiding his subjects by example rather than force. This fit neatly into the ideal of a good abbot, a leader who guided his monks through spiritual wisdom and personal virtue. When this king bee died or left, swarming, the hive was thrown into chaos, just as a monastery might struggle without a strong leader. This misunderstanding of bee biology actually reinforced their desired social and spiritual hierarchy. Imagine finding out centuries later that your revered king bee was actually a female mother figure. It might mess with your carefully constructed symbolism a bit. Even the challenges of beekeeping could be interpreted spiritually. The sting of a bee might be seen as a reminder of the pain of sin or the trials of earthly life, a small suffering to be endured with patience. The threat of pest or disease could be likened to the spiritual dangers and temptations that threaten the soul or the community. Overcoming these challenges through careful tending and faith was a microcosm of the larger spiritual battle against evil. The monks' perception of bees wasn't just detached scientific observation, which wasn't really a thing yet in the modern sense. It was an integrated part of their worldview, where the natural and the divine were intimately connected. The hum of the apiary wasn't just the sound of work, it was the sound of a living, buzzing metaphor, a constant reminder of the virtues of industry, order, purity, and community that were the foundation of their spiritual lives. The bees were humble teachers, their lives a silent, yet powerful, sermon preached in the language of nature. They were not just resources, they were tiny, holy role models, their existence a testament to the intricate beauty and purposeful design of God's creation. And while these holy role models provided so much, they also faced dangers, requiring the monks to step in as protectors. You've marveled at the bees as tiny, holy role models, their lives a buzzing sermon on virtue and order. You've seen how their pure product illuminated sacred spaces and sustained the community. But even these seemingly perfect creatures, these miniature symbols of divine design, faced dangers. The monastic apiary, for all its sheltered location and careful tending, was not immune to the harsh realities of the medieval world. The monks weren't just managing bees, they were constantly battling adversaries, both seen and unseen, that threatened their precious colonies and the vital resources they provided. It wasn't just about getting stung. It was about protecting a fundamental part of the monastery's survival. Imagine standing in the apiary, perhaps on a crisp autumn morning after the harvest. You've left enough honey for the remaining colonies to survive the winter, you hope. But even with full stores, the bees are vulnerable. The same natural world that provides the nectar and pollen is also home to creatures who see the hive as a convenient pantry or a warm winter home. Predators were a constant threat. Badgers, with their strong claws, could easily rip open a skep or log hive to get at the comb and the tasty larvae and honey inside. Foxes might try to nose their way in. Mice were particularly insidious, especially in winter. They'd sneak into the hive seeking warmth and shelter, and once inside, they'd not only eat honey and pollen but also chew through comb, destroying the structure and stressing the colony. Imagine trying to evict a family of determined mice from a crowded beehive in the middle of winter. Probably not a quiet or pleasant task. You might need a tiny medieval mousetrap, or maybe just a very brave cat who doesn't mind a few stings. Larger animals, like bears in some more remote regions, could completely devastate an apiary in a single raid. While less likely within the immediate, defended confines of a large monastery, it was a risk for smaller, more isolated communities or apiaries located further afield. The monks had to be vigilant, ensuring their apiary was as secure as possible, perhaps with stout fences or by placing hives in elevated or hard-to-reach locations. Protection wasn't just against animals, though. Humans were also a threat. Honey and wax were valuable commodities, and an unguarded apiary was a tempting target for thieves, whether desperate peasants or opportunistic bandits. The monastery walls themselves offered the best defense against human theft, but even outside the walls, measures like thorny hedges or keeping the apiary somewhat hidden could help deter unwelcome visitors. Beyond physical predators, the bees faced internal enemies, pests and diseases that the monks had limited means to combat or even understand. We touched on wax moths earlier, but they are worth emphasizing. These moths lay eggs in the hive, and their larvae, often called wax worms, are voracious eaters of beeswax. In a weak or stressed colony, or in stored comb, a wax moth infestation could quickly consume the entire structure of the hive, leaving behind a messy web of silk and debris. For the monks, who needed that comb for both honey storage and wax production, this was ruinous. They would try to keep the apiary clean, removing dead colonies or old comb promptly, and ensuring strong colonies that could better defend themselves. But controlling an established infestation without modern pesticides would have been incredibly difficult. It was a constant battle against these tiny, destructive invaders. Then there were the diseases. Medieval monks observed their bees getting sick. They saw signs like lethargy, unusual numbers of dead bees outside the hive, or problems with the brood, the bee larvae and pupae. But they lacked the understanding of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, that cause most bee diseases. If a colony began to suffer from foulbrood, for example, a highly contagious bacterial disease that infects the larvae, the monks wouldn't know why the brood was dying and developing that characteristic foul smell. They might see it as the colony being weak, unhealthy, or perhaps cursed. Their only recourse was often to try and strengthen the colony with feeding if possible, or simply let it die and hope the problem didn't spread. Destroying the infected hive and burning the equipment was a drastic measure, but sometimes necessary, though they might not have fully understood the principle of contagion. It was like trying to fight an invisible enemy with your bare hands. You knew something was wrong, but you didn't know what or how to truly fix it. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval beekeeping texts and agricultural manuals often included advice on identifying and attempting to mitigate problems like wax moths and predators, reflecting the constant struggle medieval beekeepers faced in protecting their colonies from these common threats. These texts show that while their understanding of the underlying causes of disease was limited, they were keen observers of the symptoms and developed practical, if not always effective, strategies based on empirical experience. Natural challenges also counted as adversaries. A long, harsh winter could decimate colonies, especially if stores were misjudged or if the bees were stressed by pests or disease. A cold, wet spring could limit early foraging, setting the colonies back. A summer drought could reduce the availability of nectar and pollen, leading to poor honey yields and weak colonies going into winter. These were forces of nature the monks had little control over, relying on prayer and hope as much as practical preparation. They couldn't irrigate the wildflowers or change the weather. It was a stark reminder of their dependence on the unpredictable rhythms of the natural world. Historians still argue whether the frequent loss of colonies in medieval apiaries due to disease, pests, or poor overwintering success was a major limiting factor in the scale of monastic beekeeping, or if the bees' natural resilience and the monks' ability to capture swarms allowed them to maintain productivity despite these losses. Was it a constant struggle for survival, or a system that, while inefficient by modern standards, was robust enough for their needs? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a precarious balance between nature's challenges and human, and bee, resilience. The management of these adversaries was largely reactive rather than proactive. You responded to a badger attack after it happened. You noticed the signs of wax moths when the damage was already underway. You watched helplessly as disease spread through a hive. There were no preventative treatments, no genetic selection for disease resistance. That level of understanding was centuries away. It relied on constant vigilance, quick responses when problems were identified, and the hope that the healthy colonies would thrive despite the threats. It required a certain humility, an acceptance that you couldn't control everything, and that sometimes, despite your best efforts, nature would take its course. A quirky tidbit relates to the belief that the sound of bees could ward off evil. Some medieval traditions held that the buzzing of a healthy hive was unpleasant to demons and other malevolent spirits. Placing apiaries near homes or churches was sometimes seen not just as practical, close to forage, easy to watch, but also as a form of spiritual protection, the constant hum acting as a divine shield against unseen adversaries. Imagine thinking that the sound of your bees working was literally casting out evil. It adds a whole new layer to the importance of a noisy, bustling hive. You weren't just listening to industry, you were listening to a tiny, buzzing exorcism. So, while the bees were symbols of purity and order, and provided immense blessings, they were also creatures facing a multitude of threats. The medieval monks, for all their dedication and accumulated knowledge, fought a constant, often losing, battle against predators, pests, and diseases they couldn't fully understand. Protecting the holy swarm required vigilance, practical measures based on observation, and an acceptance of the unpredictable forces of nature. It was a demanding, sometimes frustrating aspect of monastic life, a reminder that even the most valuable and symbolically significant parts of God's creation require diligent protection in a world full of dangers. This struggle against adversaries is part of the story of why monastic beekeeping eventually faded, leaving behind only echoes of its once vital hum. You've wrestled with the hives, braved the buzzing chaos, harvested the honey, and purified the wax. You've seen the practical value, the immense importance of these tiny creatures to your daily life, your health, your ability to practice your faith. You've also faced the mysteries, the colonies that thrive inexplicably, the ones that fail without obvious cause, the unpredictable nature of swarming. And you've battled the adversaries, the predators, the pests, the unseen diseases that constantly threatened your precious charges. This demanding, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately vital connection to the bees shaped a significant part of monastic life for centuries. But like all eras, the age of monastic beekeeping dominance eventually began to fade, leaving behind only echoes of its once vital hum. The decline wasn't sudden, but a gradual process tied to broader changes in medieval and post-medieval society. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, several factors chipped away at the central role of monasteries. The rise of powerful secular states meant that kings and nobles gained more control over land and resources, diminishing the relative wealth and independence of monastic institutions. Events like the Black Death in the mid-14th century dramatically reduced populations, including monks, disrupting monastic life and labor systems. Later, the Reformation in the 16th century led to the dissolution of many monasteries in Protestant countries, their lands and assets seized by the state. Even where monasteries persisted, their economic and social influence lessened compared to their peak during the High Middle Ages. As society evolved, so did agricultural practices. Secular beekeepers became more numerous and organized. While monasteries had been key centers for preserving and spreading knowledge, beekeeping skills and techniques became more widely dispersed among the general population. New types of hives and methods were slowly developed outside the cloister walls. For instance, while monks largely stuck with skeps and log hives, secular beekeepers began experimenting more with wooden boxes, eventually paving the way for hives with internal structures, though movable frames were still centuries away. The economic landscape also shifted. While honey and wax remained valuable, the gradual increase in the availability of sugar, imported from the East and later grown in the Americas, sadly, often through forced labor, began to challenge honey's supremacy as the sole sweetener. Sugar was expensive at first, but its increasing availability, particularly in urban centers, lessened the overwhelming demand for honey as the primary source of sweetness for everyone. This didn't make honey worthless, but it changed its position in the market. Similarly, while beeswax remained the gold standard for candles, particularly in churches, the demand for secular lighting began to be met by other sources, and eventually, innovations in candle making and later, other forms of lighting like oil lamps and eventually gas and electric light, reduced the universal reliance on beeswax for illumination outside of specific ceremonial contexts. A mainstream historical fact is that the dissolution of monasteries in England under Henry VIII in the 1530s dealt a severe blow to large-scale, organized beekeeping in that country, as monastic apiaries were dismantled and their accumulated knowledge and infrastructure were scattered. This was mirrored in other parts of Europe during the Reformation. So, the great monastic apiaries, which had buzzed for centuries, gradually became less central to the European beekeeping scene. The monks' roles shifted. While some monasteries continued to keep bees, often maintaining their traditional methods, they were no longer the primary innovators or the largest producers. The baton of beekeeping development passed more firmly into the hands of secular beekeepers and later, scientific inquiry. But the legacy of monastic beekeeping is far from insignificant. For centuries, monasteries were crucial repositories of agricultural knowledge, including apiculture. They preserved texts from the ancient world, like parts of Virgil's Georgics, and added their own observations and practices to create medieval beekeeping manuals. They experimented, in their own way, with hive placement, swarm management, and pest control. They adapted beekeeping techniques to the European climate and available materials. Their organized, communal approach allowed for a scale of production and consistency that was difficult for individual secular beekeepers to match for much of the early and high Middle Ages. You might say they were the medieval equivalent of a large agricultural research station, just with more chanting and less sophisticated lab equipment. Probably no centrifuges either. Historians still argue whether the primary contribution of monastic beekeeping was simply the preservation and transmission of existing ancient knowledge during a chaotic period, or if they actively developed significant new techniques and understandings that advanced the craft beyond what they inherited. While they certainly didn't invent beekeeping, their role in keeping the tradition alive and adapting it to the European context was undeniably important. Their emphasis on the value and purity of beeswax, and its essential role in sacred light, deeply influenced religious practice throughout Europe and continues to this day in many churches where beeswax candles are still preferred for the altar. The symbolism they drew from the bees, industry, order, purity, community, became ingrained in European cultural and religious thought, influencing sermons, literature, and art for centuries. The image of the monk tending his bees, drawing lessons from their labor, is a lasting one. A quirky tidbit that reflects this enduring legacy is the continued use of beeswax in various traditional crafts and products today, from furniture polish and leather dressing to cosmetics and even dental wax. While modern science understands the properties of beeswax chemically, its association with purity, naturalness, and quality often stems from its historical use, particularly the high standards of purification developed over centuries, including by monastic beekeepers for their precious candle wax. Next time you use a beeswax product, picture a medieval monk patiently melting and straining that sticky comb. You might even feel a sense of historical connection, though hopefully without the risk of getting stung. So, while the direct monastic control over vast apiaries waned, the knowledge they helped to preserve and disseminate, the value they placed on the products of the hive, and the symbolism they drew from the bees continued to resonate. The hum of the hive, once a central sound of monastic life, dispersed into the broader agricultural landscape, carried on by secular beekeepers who built upon the foundations laid by the monks and their ancient predecessors. As you sit here now, warm and safe, far from the cold stone and buzzing hives of the medieval monastery, you can still feel the echoes of that world. The sweetness of honey on your tongue, the clean light of a candle, the distant hum of a bee passing by your window, they all carry a whisper of those cowled figures who, guided by faith and necessity, learned to work with nature's tiny alchemists, turning sunshine and flowers into liquid gold and sacred light. Their story is a reminder of the deep, often surprising, connections between the natural world, human ingenuity, and the enduring quest for sustenance, light, and meaning in a world that was, in many ways, far darker and more challenging than our own. The journey is nearing its end now. You've walked the cold stone floors, felt the sting of the medieval air, heard the constant, quiet hum of the bees. You've seen the humble hives, tasted the simple sweetness, and witnessed the sacred glow of beeswax light. The monks and their tiny charges, their struggles and their triumphs, are fading back into the mists of history, their story told for tonight. Let the images soften, the buzzing grow faint. There's no need to hold on to the chill of the stone or the sting of the bee. Let the sounds of the cloister fade, replaced by the quiet rhythm of your own breath. The work is done, the lessons learned, the light has guided us to this peaceful moment. Just the soft hum remains, a gentle lullaby from a time long past. Allow yourself to drift, carried on that quiet sound, settling into stillness and rest. The monastery sleeps, the bees are quiet in their hives, and soon, you will be too.